Hello and welcome to the third video in the Chunky Lookbook accompaniment video series. Today we are actually going to skip the water tab and go straight to the camera tab because I don't feel like doing the water tab right now. So, first thing on the camera tab, we have presets. These are obviously just put in by the developer himself, and you can just choose one. It gives you, for example, an isometric view. You can change the field of view or zoom with the camera settings here. For some reason it sets it to 180 at the max on the slider, so you're going to want to type in perhaps a bigger number to get a larger view. And all of these isometric presets, by the way, are using the parallel camera mode, which we'll go over later. So all of these are just going to give you a different direction, and they should keep the field of view that you set. And they may also keep, they may only change the angles. So for example, if I do this, it may, oh no, it looks like it actually, no. It keeps the focus point and the field of view, and it should keep depth of field as well. So for example, if I change this and change the preset, yeah, it's still blurry. So the only thing that these isometric presets change are actually the direction of the camera, or rather, in this case, the direction of the physical Minecraft world relative to the camera. And okay, so then we have these Skybox Views, which are going to show you the right side of the skybox, the left side of the skybox. Look up, look down. For some reason we're below the land, I'm not sure why. And all the other sides of the skybox as well. For now, we'll actually just go back to sort of the default here on the standard view, and I'm not sure what the heck. That's why we have actually gone below the ground here. So now if I set these skybox, it doesn't change the camera position. That's the other thing. So if you're below the ground, then the skybox presets will still put you below the ground. Whereas if you go above the ground, then they will turn the camera such that it faces whichever face of the skybox you are choosing. Okay. And it will keep the projection that you've chosen. So when you do parallel and then set the, oh, never mind, it does not. It keeps it in standard for those presets. So the presets will include the angle of the camera and I guess the mode of the camera. Alright, so first thing we can do besides choosing some presets is we can set multiple cameras that we can then switch to. So for example, I can place one camera here, and this is camera number 1. Now I can clone it, and now we're on camera 2, and we'll move it over here. And if I set back to camera 1, it switches right back to this view, camera 2, go back to that view. We can choose another one, camera 3, and now we can switch between the 3 cameras very easily. So we'll go back to camera 1. Now in the position and orientation box here, we can manually edit the position and orientation. So for example, I'm somewhere around 234 here, and if I go to 500, then I'm much higher. So this is the y coordinate, this is x, and this is z. X, y, z, and y in Minecraft is up. And x should be east-west. Yes, okay. So x is east-west with west being the negative direction and east being the positive direction. And z is north-south, with north being the negative direction. So south-east are the positive directions in z and x, respectively. And obviously, positive is up in y. So if you want to manually choose your position, that's how you do it. Additionally, and that is relative to, I believe, just the world coordinates, not like anything. It's not like some weird number that Chunky made up. Like when you go to this position, that's what position you would be in the Minecraft world if you actually loaded this world in Minecraft. And then orientation should be pretty simple. Usually you're only going to be changing these two boxes, which are going to be your rotation left and right and your rotation up and down. However, the third box can change your rotation on the axis perpendicular to the camera. So for example, if I set it to 60 degrees, we're now 60 degrees off axis here. So if you want some weird camera angles, you can just use the third box here, which is the roll, of course. And we have pitch and yaw here. That might be yaw, actually. I think it's backwards. Yaw, pitch, and roll. If anybody actually knows what those mean. Okay. So additionally, we can choose camera to player. As you can see, the player is nowhere near the camera in this case. So it moves a great deal. And if we center the camera, it centers the camera on not 0, 0 in the world, but rather the center of what you loaded into Chunky. So if I loaded a random chunk that is way off in the distance and then centered the camera, it would actually put me between all of these chunks and the one way over here. Alright, so that should cover all of these. Oh, and if you don't want any of these camera angles, you can remove them by clicking that button. Alright, so now we'll get to the projection modes, which is sort of the main section of this tab. So the standard projection is pretty simple, just works like a regular old camera lens. It has a bit of distortion around the edge, just like a lens would. Depending on the field of view, you're going to get more distortion, of course, with higher field of view here. And a lower field of view, you have much less distortion around the edges. And it works pretty much exactly like a real camera. So if you know how to operate a proper camera, then this should be quite simple. So another thing that comes from knowing how to do real photography is dealing with the different fields of view here. So you'll know that if you've ever done photography, you should know that if I focus on this object here, for example, and I zoom in and then I back out so that it's the same size that it used to be, that the objects in the background don't change as much in size as the objects in the foreground as I zoom out. Or not zoom out rather, but physically move the camera out. Whereas if I were to then zoom out and move, whoop, I just killed the program. Cut. Anyway, as I was saying, you can use this to achieve an effect such as having the mountains in the background looking very, very large. If you go really far away and zoom in, then these mountains back here form a very nice big backdrop for the whole scene. Whereas if I were to sort of zoom back out and then move forwards towards this ship really, then the mountains in the background are much smaller. And this would be the same effect as changing the length of your lens on an actual camera. The other sort of lenses that we have available here, well, are the Fisheye Lens, which acts just like a fisheye lens. So you can do this sort of effect where you the world's almost like a ball looking shape or whatever, and you can look up. If you get down low and you look up at something, then the land will curve upwards at the edges, and if you look down at something, then it curves downwards at the edges, and that's sort of how the distortion works. And everything always looks cooler with a fisheye lens, so this is the only mode that you should ever use. Anyway, stereographic actually has a very similar effect to a fisheye lens. Also, you can do that. You can do that with a fisheye lens too. And stereographic actually has an even more of this sort of ball world effect, which is sort of the intent. So you can do these sorts of renders, which are kind of fun. See those quite often actually. So that's pretty neat. I'm not sure why you would use this over the standard projection for anything other than a gimmick, but it's there if you want it. And then we have two panorama modes. This is the equirectangular mode. Not entirely sure what that means. However, you can see that we have a field of view of 120, and there's 120 degrees. If I set it to 180, then we're going to have 180 degrees. And that 180 degrees is actually per square. So since this is not a square, if I set this to a square, X, then what we have is 180 degrees from this side to this side. So for example, if I go over here down to the ground, you can see that on one side we have this part going all the way off into the distance on that side and all the way off into the distance on that side. So they're exactly 180 degrees apart. And if I make this, for example, only 500 tall, then we'll have a full 360 degree view. Like so. So this here and this here are actually connected. So 180 degrees per square is how it works in equirectangular mode. And it also gets really wobbly if you point it away from the horizon. So if you want this weird look for some reason, you can do that. Otherwise, you'll want to actually set this so that this is at -90, there, so that everything is nice and straight. And this will give you, this should be a 360-degree view of the entire world, with 360 degrees all the way across. And it may include 360 degrees from top to bottom. Yes, it should. I believe so. So you could use this to create 360-degree panoramas. Then you can use the slot panorama, which does not have such mathematical constraints, and instead, when you increase the field of view, it actually increases the field of view not only from left to right, but also up and down, and so you end up squishing everything into this tiny sliver on the screen as it compresses the vertical much more than it does the horizontal in this case. And as I zoom in, it starts to act more like a normal lens. So if you want a panorama that has a really wide view, then you could do this. One thing that you'll end up with, though, for example, and this would apply to the equirectangular mode as well, if you made this much wider than it is tall, like, then you're going to start repeating things. So you can see this building here is also over here, the sun's here twice. So we actually have everything here twice, is what's happening. So if I put the sun here, then the sun's actually going to show, oh, you know what, that's not going to happen, because it's not at 180 degrees. It'll show it better on this mode. So here, I'll set it to 180 degrees. So now that I actually have twice, I have 4 squares going. So I'm actually going to get 360 degrees from here to here, and then I'm going to have it again from here to here. So I have this duplicated thing going on, and this will tile infinitely. So if I made this 125 tall, then it will actually tile 4 times, like so. And you can get really weird stuff like that. So to use this mode sort of more normally, you should probably do depending on the field of view, if you have 180 degrees, then you want to use 2 squares, 2000 by 1000 or 2 by 1. But since I have 90 degrees here, I actually can use 4 squares. So if I set this to 2000 by 500, not 5000, 500. There we go. Then I will have my 360 degrees from here to here. And this is in slot mode. And so once again we get this weird distortion as I move away from the horizon. So you'll want to point it at the horizon. And yeah, they both kind of do similar things. Not really sure what the difference is between this one here. I'll just clone this camera and then I'll set this to slot. Okay, so switching between these two, it looks like the slot one, like I said earlier, compresses the vertical dimension more than the equirectangular one. And I think as you increase the field of view, that's gonna increase as well. So now if I switch between these two, it's even more squished. So this one should keep the vertical and horizontal dimensions the same when you zoom in and out. And the slot mode will compress the vertical dimension as you zoom in and out. Alright. So now let's go on to these stereo modes. We'll go back to parallel in a bit. So this would be your left eye. Here, let me change this to normal. Okay. So this is omnidirectional stereo, which basically just means you're going to render this twice. Omnidirectional, of course, means all directions. So if you have 180, and actually here we'll make a 360 stereo panorama. So we'll actually just set this to 1000 by 500. So we have two squares. So now this is 360 degrees. And now this is your left eye, and this is your right eye. So it's moving the camera relative to the actual camera position. It's sort of shifting it a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, so that if you look at this one with your left eye and you look at this one with your right eye, you'll actually see the panorama in 3D. So you can use this to create like 360 degree stereo panoramas that you could view in like VR or something. And if you were to turn this down, it doesn't do anything because it says omnidirectional right there. So it's going to give you that 180 degrees per square no matter what you do. So if you don't want it to have all 180 degrees, then or 360 in this case, then you're going to have to make it less than 2 squares. So if I have 1 square, then I have 180 degrees. So we take this picture here. Let's see, which one is this? This is the right eye, okay. So if I screenshot that, that's the right eye. And then if I switch it to the left eye, actually I gotta switch these around. And now, here's the trick. If you cross your eyes so that these two images line up with one another, you'll see it in 3D. You'll be able to actually see the depth that's there. So that's how it works. So if you're into making like 360 degree panorama stereo things that you can look at in VR or whatever, then that's how you would do it. So next we'll actually look at these settings here: field of view, depth of field, and subject distance. Oh, and I guess I have to look at parallel mode first. Parallel mode is basically just gives you an isometric view of what you're looking at. So there's no distance. Everything is sort of just the same size. So things further away aren't going to look smaller than things that are closer, basically. And so you can use this to create these isometric views. And that's pretty much it. It's not really so exciting. Although one thing you can do is use it to get really nice landscape shots where things in the background look really big, especially when they're really far away. So you can see here, for example, that the mountain in the background looks huge compared to this in the foreground, because in your mind you're used to seeing things further away be smaller. So when you see this, you know that it's far away, so you expect it to be small, but because it's actually so big on the screen, your mind actually, it just feels bigger than it actually is. Whereas if I switch this to standard mode, you can see it's clearly not going to look like that if you were actually like right here looking at it. It's quite small on the physical space. And so that would be a similar effect as zooming in like this and then moving out like we did before. It's just an even more exaggerated effect when you do it in the parallel projection. Alright, so obviously we've already sort of covered field of view. It zooms in and out, and that's what it says right here. So less zooms in, more zooms out. Done. Depth of field. Actually, let's first look at subject distance. So when you have something that you want to focus on, the easiest way to focus on it is actually to just point the crosshair at the object, click autofocus, and then adjust the depth of field. So now we know that it's 46 blocks away because that's what we're pointing at. And now we can adjust the depth of field to be whatever we want, and this point will always be in focus 46 blocks away. So anything that's 46 blocks away around the camera is going to be in focus here. And if I make the depth of field bigger, then things around that will get in focus, and the bigger I make the depth of field, the more things will be in focus. So for example, I can choose which point on the road here is in focus. So if I make this really small, then I can adjust. So you can see now the point of focus right now is here, and I can move it further away by increasing the subject's distance. So now this is the part that's in focus. And now I move it further away, and now it's somewhere down here. So you can do that sort of effect. And so if you want to create some sort of tilt shift effect, then what you would do is you would just use a really low depth of field, essentially. So you would go out like here, and you would focus on this building or whatever, and then you just lower the depth of field so that it's like really small, and now you get this sort of tilt shift effect. And this is going to be a real tilt shift effect rather than sort of like a fake tilt shift effect that you would get by just sort of applying like a blur in Photoshop and then sort of cutting off the blurry layer in the middle, which is sort of like the cheesiest way to get a tilt shift effect. Whereas this is actually a real effect where the things that are actually further away and really close are going to be blurrier, and they're going to be blurrier and blurrier the closer or further away they are. And anything that's like sticking out, so for example, you would not be able to do such an effect in Photoshop so easily if you have an object in the foreground covering up the object that you are focusing on. So I'm focusing here, but I have this in the foreground. So if I were trying to do this in Photoshop and I were trying to just blur out the foreground and the background and only have this part in focus, I would also have to select this object and blur that out, and that would be much more difficult than just actually using the right lens, or in this case just setting the focus settings correctly to achieve this effect. So that would be how you do it, like a tilt shift effect. And then obviously you would use a less ridiculous version of the same effect in some sort of pseudo landscape, something like this. You know, maybe I don't want it to have like completely in focus, like maybe I just want it to look a little more realistic. So now like it's focused here, and now the background is slightly blurry, and this is going to be slightly blurry, so it would be more like a real life non-tilt shift, like a normal photo. And of course you can just increase this to infinite to have every single thing in the scene always be in focus. But that's not nearly as artistic now, is it? Because everyone knows that art in photography relies on how much depth of field you have. Okay. So that should be it for the camera tab. Yeah. When I do water, I know I said I would be doing it in this video, in my last video, but it's just such a small tab, and some of it is just because of the materials tab. These sort of fit in with how the water works, so I think I'm going to combine the materials tab with the water tab whenever I decide to actually do that video, instead of just doing water and then leaving you with it, because then you're not going to know how to change these things, especially index of refraction, which is going to be really important for water. If you're doing any sort of underwater shots, you're actually going to want to know how to do this. Other than that, yeah, see you all in the next video.